Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this session. Thank you very much for joining us today as we will be talking a little bit about the GEM Global Report and some of the things that we've learned in writing the GEM Global Report that might be useful for you as you think about your national reports. I'm Kevin Anselmo. I lead our communications for GEM, and I'm joined by Forrest Wright, who will introduce himself in just a moment. Forrest is GEM's data manager. So we love to do these training sessions. Ideally, we like to do these on a regular basis. Obviously, during the kind of peak times of the research cycle, it's a bit more difficult to get to these training sessions. I wanted to thank everyone for providing different questions that you would like to address in future training sessions. We will certainly take those questions into account. I also noticed that several of you put questions about the APS and NES in the registration form. That also is very helpful. And just to let you know, we will be answering each and every single one of those questions. So Francis Carmona and Alicia Codoras are putting together responses to those questions, and we will send those out in an email communication. During this training session, I will be presenting for about 20 minutes and Forrest will be presenting for about 20 minutes. We'll kick off with Forrest first. Encourage you throughout the session to let us finish our slides and then we'll have a Q&A. However, while we're presenting, please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions and we can either respond to those questions on the fly or get to those at the Q&A segment at the end of today's session. Be on the lookout for future training sessions as well. We plan to have a session dedicated to the NES in May and the APS in June. So we really want to make these as useful and valuable for you as possible. And really the goal is to learn and exchange ideas. We hope that you can learn from us and also we want to learn from you. So I think that's all I have in terms of introductory remarks, and I'll turn it over now to Forrest.
Okay, I'll share my screen here. Okay. Everyone see that PowerPoint, Kevin?
We see, yes.
Okay. All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Forrest Wright. Thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. I'm the data manager here at GEM. We run a pretty small operation, so even though I have the title of data manager, I also do a lot of contributions to the annual report, including writing some sections and kind of helping with some visualizations. So we thought that if teams are writing their national report, they might learn something from the process that I go through, which is kind of to create like a mini national report, I'll call it, when we create the GEM annual report. So one thing quickly though, I kind of realized as we were approaching the call that not everyone here is acquainted with their annual report, because we do have some new teams. I know Venezuela is on the call and they're certainly a new team. So one thing I want to do quickly is to share what this looks like. And for some of you, this is going to be a recap. You'll be all too familiar with the annual report, but for some people here on the call, this will be new to them. So I think it's valuable to go over this. Can you see that screen, Kevin? Okay, so this is just an example of Luxembourg. I just scrolled to this one. So this is what we call an economy profile. This is in the second half of the GEM annual report. So here we list some baseline figures for each participating GEM economy. So you'll see some of the indicators that we list here. We have a spider graph on these for the NES, the National Expert Survey scores. And then this is what I want to talk about most, this policy roadmap. I write one of these for each GEM economy. And you know, it's a few hundred words. Your team reports will be much longer, but it's kind of like a mini snapshot of some of the results of the GEM data and how it might relate to policy. So that now that I've gotten over that, I want to launch into the slideshow, as I think hopefully that was enough introduction to the annual report. Okay, so with that in mind, going forward, I'm just going to talk about my process for creating the policy roadmaps, which I just showed. And thinking of these as kind of a launching point for what you might use in your team's annual report or national report. So when I create these policy roadmaps, there's three things I keep in mind. I try to keep in mind through each one, and these are listed here. A policy narrative, comparability of the data, and then availability of the data.
Forrest,
yep.
Right now we see the Luxembourg.
Oh, oops. I bet. I thought I had shared. Okay. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thanks for catching that. So yeah, these 3 points, which you didn't see before, are now up on the screen. So yeah, policy narrative, comparability, and availability. And each of these considerations I take into every policy roadmap that I write. And I think this is a helpful framework, I think, for each team writing their national report. So when I'm talking about policy narrative, I'm talking kind of some data points that you can bring up, GEM data points, both from the APS and NES, that can help craft a narrative that could be relatable to policymakers. And this is something that you could do within your own national team report. And when I'm thinking about a policy narrative, 3 things come to mind. First, that the data points that you're talking about should be easily explainable. And so what I mean by that are some GEM indicators that I think are fairly straightforward, that I think a non-GEM expert could understand. So these would be things like TEA rate, established business rate, entrepreneurial intentions, percentage of population who see good opportunities to start a business, percentage of the population that thinks it's more difficult to start a business this year compared to last year. These are all kind of fairly straightforward GEM indicators that we create every year. And I think even with just a little bit of context setting, someone who's not a GEM expert could understand these data points. And so these are some of the data points I use in every policy roadmap that I create, with that in mind, that they're fairly explainable. And so when you start to use some of these headline indicators, I think you kind of get a sense of kind of a snapshot of the entrepreneurial activity in your country for a year. And ideally, if you've participated, over multiple years, that provides even like a richer context that you can bring up. So when I write the policy roadmaps, I try to highlight previous results when it's relevant. And then I try to kind of relate it to a policy issue. And that's admittedly kind of a tricky point, and one that I know many people at GEM struggle with, creating like a sound direct relationship between a GEM data point and a specific policy issue. But I'm going to talk about an example here where I think it might generate some thoughts, for maybe some data points that you could point out that could start to form a narrative. So obviously we create a lot of data points, but I'll just come up with an example here. Like, say your country's established business rate has been declining for a couple of years, and it's been declining all the while simultaneously entrepreneurial intentions and TEA rates, T rates have been increasing. So basically established business rates declining while intentions and early stage activities have been increasing. So those are just two GEM data points right there that point to perhaps a paradox that could actually unlock some policy implications. So you might want to consider, is this just part of the business cycle that explains why established business rates might be declining? Or perhaps there's a recent policy that's been introduced that's discouraging new businesses from becoming established ones. Or alternatively, as a new policy encouraged new business creation, but perhaps bringing another data point, while more people are starting businesses, perhaps they don't feel like they have the skills or knowledge to create a business, so they're not going to the established phase. Would everyone mind muting their, looks like we have someone on mute. Okay, thanks. So, and then from that example, you might want to consider a recommendation. If there has been a policy that's been introduced that might either discourage or overly encourage new business creation, you could point to that to have like a direct relationship to a policy issue. So next, another thing I consider is comparability when I'm writing the roadmaps. So here, this is fairly straightforward, but many teams like to compare their results to peer economies, however you define them. So, when we're doing this, I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is you're using the same indicators and the same time frame when discussing peer economies and how you might relate to them. Another thing related to comparability is to consider secondary sources. So that's one thing I do when I'm writing these policy roadmaps is think about where some of this information might be available in other sources. And if appropriate, you might want to bring them in to your discussion. So one thing I would look at potentially is like some of the results on the entrepreneurial aspiration figures, like percentage of those who see good opportunities, or those who think it's more difficult this year compared to last year. And then if there are some trusted surveys that are run in your country that get at small business sentiment surveys, you can bring those in if they seem like they have a strong comparative point with the GEM data. Another thing is, we used to reference the ease of doing business survey. That's been discontinued from the World Bank, but that would be another example of something we've done in the past. So I think bringing in other secondary sources, if they're trustworthy and can provide some additional context, is something to keep in mind and can, I think, enrich your report. And I try to do that for the policy roadmaps that I write as well when I can find something. And then finally, the last consideration for the policy roadmaps that I write is availability. So this is kind of straightforward, but consideration of both for your readers and maybe your potential audience, can users access this data? There's some finite GEM data that's not publicly available within 3 years of the current results. But a lot of the main GEM indicators are available both in the annual report and on the GEM website. So that data is available if you can point readers to where they could find it. So that's something to keep in mind. Doesn't always have to be that way, but it might be, it's something to keep in mind. Are you talking about a data point that they won't be able to cross-reference, or are you talking about something that's accessible? And then one more thing about availability, and I'll talk more about this in the next part, is the availability of GEM content that already exists on the topic. So, if you want to talk about the TEA rate for all GEM economies in your annual report, in your national report, you can reuse GEM graphics that have been used in the most recent annual report or any of the special topic reports. And I'm going to go into how you might do that in the next slide. All right. So this next part, talking about creating visuals for your report, I'll talk a little bit about how you can reuse some GEM content that's already available. And then after that, if you do decide to go, create your own visualizations, just maybe some things to keep in mind during that process. So yeah, as I mentioned before, if you're creating your national report and you want to use some GEM figures that already exist, say, TEA rate or EBO rate, established business ownership rate, that is, that has already been made in the GEM annual report. You can do that. One option is to contact GEM and you can get the figure directly from us. We have a bank of all the graphics that we've used now for the last few cycles. And so if there's any specific graphic that you want, just the high resolution image of that graphic, we can provide that to you. And we ask that, of course, you credit GEM and link back to the report where you found it, or the place that you found it. And we can provide you that language if you want to do that. And then secondarily, if you want to just take a screenshot of the graphic and place it yourself, the process would be the same as far as crediting GEM for where you found it. And there are ways to take screenshots in high resolution. So that's something you might want to do if you're just going to screenshot something and share it that way. Then finally, if you are going to go on your own and create your own visuals, there's many things to keep in mind, but some things that are just kind of best practice I found when creating visuals that might be helpful for your sake. I'll just run over a couple of those quickly. So first and foremost, and something you should always be asking throughout the process, is just, what am I trying to show? You really want to, should be obvious, but it's amazing sometimes you get so in the weeds of creating a visualization, you can kind of forget what is the real focus of what I'm trying to show. Am I trying to show the results for every economy, or do I just want to show it for our economy, or for our economy and maybe a peer GEM team? That's something to keep in mind, because there's a lot of GEM data and it can be tempting to kind of show it all. So, when you're creating your visuals, one thing that's really helpful, I think, and can set apart a visualization is the use of color. And this is just an example I found. I think it really illustrates this point. You're setting the context by showing all the results, but you have these gray gradations with the key point highlighted with that color linked. And so I think, if you're going to use this in a GEM example, you want to show your TEA rate over time. Maybe you highlight that with the gray for other economies. Another thing to keep in mind, it's kind of similar, but just there are many trends happening simultaneously. And this is an example I found that I think really highlights this point. You want to show the one that has the steepest or strongest increase or decrease. You can kind of show these all at the same time using the same concept of the color to highlight a key factor. Next one is don't overdo it. Again, here's an example from The Economist. I think is really interesting. This is one that they provided. So here they have two data points. And the graph on the left is probably okay if you know what you're looking at, but the one on the right shows that that mixing and matching of chart types right next to each other kind of provides, that teases apart the key points, and I think provides a better representation of what you really want to show. So you really should be thinking about, does this make sense to an unintroduced reader? And so maybe you might want to send it to someone who is not familiar with GEM data to see what they think. And then finally, my last point is just to look for inspirations. I thought this is a good graph that just came across randomly on business registration. So when you're reading articles or looking at blog posts or just doing anything that involves graphics, it's good to keep in mind, is this something that they've done well, or how would you improve it? So just kind of seeing inspiration for graphics, and you might be able to use them in your own report. So I think that should do it for me. I'll hand it over to Kevin, and let me know, please, if you have any questions at the end. Thank you.
You see my screen, right, Pars? Great. Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I've been working on with GEM over the last couple of years. Originally, so my job really is around communications and marketing. And when I first joined GEM, a lot of my work was really just focused on after the fact, after the report. And over time, I've been more involved in kind of helping GEM in terms of how can we make the report as marketable as possible, as easy to digest as possible. And so here are some different things that I've worked on with my colleagues. I don't necessarily share this, that these are things that you have to do, right? These are kind of just some best practices that we've been able to glean from putting together the global report, and that you can then consider, whether it makes sense to use some of these best practices in your national reports. So, I think one thing just to keep in mind for any sort of online report is it's very rare, I think, for people to read cover to cover, right? To read from the front cover to the back cover. A lot of people, when they're reading online, they are skimming for they're skimming, and then they try to find the information they need, and then they kind of do a deep dive. And so one of the things that we've done recently that you might have noticed is that our content is built around key questions. And I think it's really important that these questions are as jargon-free as possible, right? And so eliminating any sort of kind of GEM research terms that aren't necessarily clear in the beginning. And we can define that in the actual content. But for the subheads and for the table of contents here, if you were to skim through these, you'll see that this is pretty clear questions that, whether you're an expert in entrepreneurship or not, you can probably understand what the content is related to. So that's one point to consider. And so you can see how that looks like in the table of contents. And then this is an example of what it would look like within the chapters themselves. And yeah, I think it enhances the reader experience. And I also think it helps us in terms of writing and organization of the report. So one thing that we did for the global report that we just launched in February is we have a section where there's just quotes from the report authors. And you see that it's basically around the title of key thoughts for policymakers from the GEM 21-22 Global Report authors. So I think, policymakers obviously is a key audience. And so, we try to show what, out of this entire report of, 100 and some pages, what are some of the key takeaways? And it's interesting because these quotes, this is the first time we introduced this feature in our report. And I think it's worked really well. And so this is an example. You can't see the entire article here, but this was an article written by a journalist in Forbes. And it's interesting because they quoted Stephen Hill here. And that quote is actually not based on an interview. That quote is taken from that quote section. And so this is a really nice way that it's really helpful for journalists in writing their stories, that they can just take a quote and plug that into their story. Obviously, that quote is approved by us, and it's very easy for the journalists, and it's good for us because we don't have to worry about being misquoted, obviously, in this case. And then it also works really well for social media. So that same quote there for Stephen, we've used it a few times on our social media channels. And these punchy quotes work very well for social media engagement and sharing. So it's interesting for readers, it's shareable content, it's media friendly. And the most important thing is, it generates impact. Everything we want to do, we want to be able to generate impact. And so I think, impact for policymakers, impact for other key stakeholders. You will notice in our global report, we have strategic adverts placed throughout. We have these adverts that are in our global report. That also is something that's very helpful. We obviously want to highlight the ESI tool. We want to highlight the fact that we're looking for new teams. That's always a priority for us. And including an advert related to your team's priorities is something that you can also consider. It's good for visibility. It's a matter of being strategic around priorities. And it's also good and reinforces the brand. It reinforces, the fact that we're looking for teams reinforces a little bit about how GEM actually works. So another thing that's worked really well is our entrepreneur profiles. In the last global report, we had, I believe, 11 entrepreneur profiles. We talk a lot about data. We talk a lot about kind of, nuts and bolts of entrepreneurship ecosystems. It's important that we put a face to what we're talking about. And I think these entrepreneur profiles help us to do that. This is one of the jobs that I undertake in the creating of the reports. It's actually a really straightforward process. I will just send the team some different questions, and then they will ask the entrepreneurs to fill out the questions, and we highlight them here. So this humanizes our research. I think it also enhances the reader experience. We connect these entrepreneur profiles to our sponsors. So in the case here, this is someone who went to Babson, right? And obviously Babson is our global sponsor. This is a Babson alum on the left. On the right is somebody who's associated with Cartier Women's Initiative. These are obviously important report sponsors. So this is a way of including our sponsor in our content. And then this content is also shared on social media. So the final thing I want to just talk about is we have our report, GEM report guidelines. These are guidelines for your consideration to use and to leverage as needed. I will show you those in a second, but basically these are designed to support teams in creating your reports. It's important that we have a consistent look and feel. We want to be flexible, right? So ideally every GEM report, whether it's from Europe to Africa to Asia to our GEM global reports, should all look and feel the same, ideally. Now, we realize that you have other stakeholders involved, sponsors, universities. So to the extent possible, we ask that you adhere to these guidelines as you are able. Let me just show you very quickly what I'm referring to with the reports. So just give me 1 second and I'll show you. Okay, So this is what the report guidelines look like. And basically the content here, so everyone should have received this. I mean, and we do include highlight this quite a bit in our internal communications. I will also make sure this goes out in our post training session here. But basically, this is what it covers: the logo, colors, typography, like what are some different elements of a national report, things to avoid, branding, and then some key points related to messaging. And I'm sorry, I have a terrible cold at the moment. But anyway, that's the content that I wanted to share with you, and you heard from Forrest. But now some questions for you to kind of open it up for Q&A. What feedback do you have for us? What are your thoughts, positive, negatives about some of these features? Also, what best practices can you share? What types of features have specifically had an impact among stakeholders in your country? Anna, I see you're here. If you were able to kind of maybe share some of your thoughts. I know Poland's a great example of a team that creates reports that have an impact with policymakers and key stakeholders. So I was wondering if maybe you could just kick us off and kind of share your thoughts, and then happy to open up to other Q&A. Feel free to raise your hand. Feel free to also put your questions in the chat. Okay, over to you, Anna.
Yeah, just a few thoughts when I was listening to Forrest first. I totally agree with everything what you have said, and I have to admit that I have always problems when trying to present two things that really require two different axes. On the left and on the right, because when I have to, when I need to present sort of all of them together, both of them together, to show something that in my head I believe is very interesting, then I find that no one else actually can quickly grasp the idea that I want to create. So when I saw actually two charts, one next to another, I thought, okay, maybe there are many people now around us who simply don't learn how to read charts with two axes that are completely different in terms of the intervals and scales. So that's really something for me. I totally agree that we have to maybe not compare, but it's a question between comparing and between supplementing the sort of ideas we present using GEM data with secondary sources, because it's not always easy to sort of supplement our GEM data with secondary sources, because majority of sources, at least that are available in our country, are based on surveys that are using entrepreneurs, not adults, but entrepreneurs. There are also sources that are using adults, but the majority of them are entrepreneurs. That's why I found quite often difficult with GEM global report. I found very difficult the data and charts that present some data as percentages of population, not percentages of those who are involved in entrepreneurial activity. So that's the, I think, main issue that our policymakers pay attention to, because they simply, for ordinary men, it's quite easy to imagine entrepreneur, but it's more difficult to imagine an adult who is involved in entrepreneurship. That's sort of, not direct, but indirect. So I would be. So my problem is how to actually get from adult population percentages to TA, for example, percentages. The problem with like our situation is like with our GEM data is that we are observing steadily decreasing numbers of TA and rising numbers of established entrepreneurs, which cannot be supported by official statistics. So we don't know what is going on. It's really hard to explain, but it's really a problem for us to sort of find the reasonable solution. So that's one thing, and it will be definitely a problem next year because of the changes that have been introduced by our government at the beginning of this year. It's something called Polish deal. It's sort of a complete change of our tax system that actually was like how to say a storm in our country to everyone. So it will be a problem. But I want to say something positive also, because I work for the public agency that supports entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, and I'm quite close with the ministers, etc., etc. And still, I have problems how to actually share the knowledge I get from them, how to translate that data in a simple way, so that they would use those data and those information for their policy. Whenever I can, and I have some opportunities for that, because some policies are being sent to us for comments, for some ideas, and whenever GEM is suitable, I use data so that I can argue certain things. And through that, I'm simply channeling the data from GEM, which I found really useful and really necessary when you think of public policy. I'm speaking quite long, so I will shut down now and give the floor to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Just to maybe build on a point raised by Angus about the entrepreneur profiles, the questions that I asked the entrepreneurs for the basically I don't really have a set list of questions that I use for each entrepreneur. What I try to do is connect the questions to the content. So an example, I showed that Babson example. The questions in that for that gentleman were focused on entrepreneurship education. We had some female entrepreneurs. The questions for the female entrepreneurs were obviously related to kind of the challenges of that female entrepreneurs need to overcome in their ecosystem. So the questions I kind of try to, and that's for me a way of also humanizing the content, to put a face behind the data. So that's actually in the beginning when I first started out with these entrepreneur profiles. We would always ask the same questions for each entrepreneur. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I actually think it's a lot more useful for people to see questions that relate to the content. Okay, but I will share some examples of some of the questions in a follow-up communication. I will also share the recording as well, both for your reference and for any colleagues who weren't able to join. Sophia, I see your hand is up. Feel free to unmute yourself and fire away.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm Sofia Martinez, and I'm from the GEM team of Malaga in Spain. And I wanted to share with you an example of good practice that we introduced 2 years ago, and also ask you a question about the part of the NES and the experts. How do you do it? So first, the good practice, it was that I see also that you are asking about high growth startups and all these kind of new firms and with high levels of innovation, and a lot of policymakers really want to know about those firms and want to have more data. So what we did it in a more qualitative way. We added at the end of the report an annex where we took information from all the incubators that we had in the city of Malaga, both public and private incubators. We did a one-page information about the incubator, very visual information. And then we gave information about all the startups that were incubated in those incubators in the year of the publication of the report. So in this way, we gave visibility to the startup, and we had information about the sector of activity, the team, and a definition of the startup. And that was information we got from them. We sent a form to the incubators, and the incubators collected the information for us from their startups. And then we fixed the information, and we gave it a very graphical design that was very visual. And that was good because at the end, all those startups that were in the report also helped us to do it more visual, because they share it on social media, and they had their pages with their information. So they also send the report in this way and the link to a wider network. So that worked for us. And it also reply a bit that necessity about putting more focus on startup, not just entrepreneurship in general. And then my question is about how do you handle the experts that are participating in the panel when you're doing the NES? Because here, somewhere we have some experts that are okay with if we publicate their name, but others that do not want to be visible. So at the end, we always we never publish our experts panel in the report. But every year we're thinking about that, and always talking about, yeah, maybe if we publish the expert panel and we gave them a space in the report, I don't know, with the pictures, or you're with just with the name or some short information about their background, maybe that's also a good way to make the report more visible. So my question is, how do you handle that? Do you think it's a good option or not, from your experience?
Forrest or Alicia, do you want to take that?
Okay, thank you. Nice to meet you, Sophia. You have sent one of the most impressive samples of this year, and it is for a province, not for a region and for a country, but the profiles are extremely good. So let me tell you that it depends on everything. Okay, so we cannot collect personal data under the current laws. This was different in the past. And some countries think like you, that it's good to show this information. For example, in Ireland always has made visible experts, and this has been good for the project in this country. On the contrary, there are most of the countries, experts do not want to appear. And in the last group, which Anna is part of, with and Andrews, Rodrigo, and Forrest, there was a discussion on the sample reliability, you know. And since the NES is a qualitative more than quantitative methodology, one of the key points of the reliability is the expert's profile. How can we justify they are really experts? The years of experience, they give us this data in the interviews. How many years are they working in topics related with entrepreneurship? And they also, in your report, we have the expert's background. And I observed that the quality of profiles has been increasing year after year. And now the samples are very good. But there are still a certain skepticism around doing this type of survey, okay? Well, I think that your idea, so if we could make them more visible, especially in terms of reliability, that they are their profiles are very adequate to answer this questionnaire, this would be good for the NES as a tool and its credibility. But again, we have the problem of personal data protection. So one way, maybe we should think, all of us on this, we could at least put a summary about the background experts and the average of how many years are they working in topics related with entrepreneurship, or they are entrepreneurs, etc. So we should take more profit of the background experts information that we have in our files. Okay. Thank you very much. Forrest, if you have something to add, please go on.
No, that was great, Alicia. Thank you for that. So I was wondering, and maybe Alicia, you could weigh in on this, if the experts were to consent for their name to be used individually, do you think that would work, or would it have to be an across-the-board policy because of the privacy concerns, if they individually said they would want to be included? Alicia, do you have any? Okay, so I guess that's a thumbs up for that approach.
I think there is a question, at least last year, where they filled in if they wanted to appear or not, if they wanted to name visible, and then we realized that, well, most of them wanted, but we had 3 or 4 that didn't fill in that question, so that's why we decided not to do anything with that. But it's something we talk about every year, and because it's a good opportunity, it's good information, it's a way also to do it with higher quality. I mean, if we share that, we have really good experts, so why not sharing that to increase the quality? But well, we have to find a way not to respect the personal data, of course.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think this is one thing. It's also it's specific to your case, but I think it's also in general for pretty much anyone who's writing a national or regional team report. The expert surveys create a lot of valuable data, but it's hard to talk about these things when we're discussing 50 teams and then all of the regions within our annual report. So at the national and regional level in your reports, I think it's a really good time to highlight some of those findings, because you can dig in a little bit on that qualitative data. And an example too would be some of the experts' responses to the open-ended questions. I know that those questions are always coded at the end within a 20-point category list. But before that point, you can also use that data if they had a nuanced answer that you want to highlight, and they consent to being published in the report. That's one way to go about that. And so I'm glad you brought up that point, because it's hard to kind of exploit the findings of the NES survey because it is very specific to each economy. So the national and the regional level is really the place to do that. So we definitely encourage teams to pursue that. And feel free to reach out to myself and Alicia if you have any other questions on that, because we might be able to guide how you might use that data.
Thank you, Sophia, for that question. I just wanted to respond here to a question from Armin in Germany, from Germany. I answered that question in the chat, but maybe just to share a few points, because I think it might be relevant to others on this call. So Armin asked about media. What's the best way to get on the radar of journalists? How do we get visibility for a national report in the press? And what kind of topics are of interest to media? And the answer around what's of interest to the media, it really varies quite a bit. The key points I want to share is in the branding guidelines document, there's a whole section on best practices, PR best practices, how to engage with journalists. That's point number one. Point number two is, I think everyone here has my email address. I am happy to work one-to-one with you, one to however many are in your team, and come up with a PR plan for your national report. And that might involve, who you should be reaching out to in your country. It also might involve, how can we promote your national report through our different GEM communication channels. So, you're all aware that we have a newsletter, both an internal newsletter and an external newsletter. We always highlight new national reports there. I will often work with different teams on putting together a short little summary, a news summary that goes on the GEM website. That's used obviously to promote your national report. Obviously, we promote from social media. I am happy to work with your team, so please feel free to reach out to me. The best practices included in the guidelines document are certainly they're best practices. I think there's lots of good information there. Obviously, the context and the every context, every report might have its own nuances and might require follow-up consultation. So just wanted to add that.
Kevin, quickly, if you don't mind, one more point. This is kind of maybe a bit about media practice. If you're going to try to pitch to the media, and Kevin, I'd imagine you probably support this too, of like anything that's identifying a contradiction or a paradox seems to be a really good hook for media. So like an example would be, say, business registrations in your country have been steadily increasing for a long time, but it looks like DEA or established business rates are declining. That's a paradox that you can pitch as like as a story, and the headline would be something like, business registrations are increasing, but how, what is the quality of these businesses? And even though it's maybe, it's a bit punchy for GEM data to make such an assertion, but, you can kind of back it up with the data that GEM collects. You say, all these businesses are getting registered, but, how many of them are actually making it to the next stage? And, are they employing just one person versus several people? That's also GEM data points we collect. Do they plan on hiring one person or several people? These are all kind of things you can point to. So something like a top line finding, and then how GEM data might either support or contradict that. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Any other questions or comments or best practices to share? We have 5 minutes before the top of the hour.
Peter had something on copyright. We might have to get back.
Yeah.
I don't know that offhand, so.
Yeah, I just responded in the chat to that.
Okay. I see.
I would think, yes. I mean, so Chris Aylett, when he was operations manager, he would handle those sorts of logistics, and Aurea now it would probably be best positioned to answer. I would think the answer to that is yes, but I think probably best for the operations team to provide feedback on that. And I will ask, I will follow up, Peter, with Aurea on that point. Can we ask a question about APS now? Sure. Feel free, though Francis is not here on this call, and we're going to have a follow-up session on the APS, but please feel free to ask that question. And yeah, we can, if we can't answer that now, we can answer that at a later point. Feel free to unmute yourself, Masa, if you'd like to ask that question.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Masa Samsami from GEM team in Spain. Actually, I have a question about the APS part, because as you know that in Spain, we have some data at the regional level, not only at the national level. In the some indicators, we have some problem for the sample size, specifically when we want to evaluate it, for example, in field of the motives, innovation, growth expectation, and so forth. But now I can see in the some indicators, we have a data at the town established. But in order to solve the problem for the sample size, I want to know that why we don't have a data as a merged data between the first block and the second block as a nascent and about the honors. It can be great because we can solve it totally for the consideration of the totally sample. That's my questions.
Yeah, so Masa, thanks for that question. That's fairly technical, and it's definitely something that I'd want to get Francis's feedback on. So do you have Francis's email? Masa?
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And what we can do
Yeah.
is we can share that question, Masa, with Francis. And as we put together this kind of Q&A based on all the questions that were asked in that registration form, we will include that question as well and have Francis respond to that. So thank you. And as I mentioned, we would like to have a follow-up session on APS, the next month or two.
Yeah. And so I just put that.
I have answered some of the questions about the mixed use of APS and other data and about sampling, but I could not understand well the problem, Masha. Can you repeat it?
Hello, Alicia as well. Actually, that is the question, my specifically question about the sum indicators in order to solve the sample problem for the sample size. Because we wanted to evaluate it at the regional level. For instance, we wanted to evaluate it in detail about the innovation and growth expectation, for instance. We will have a small sample in some regions.
Yeah.
To consideration of between the 10 established, we need to consider as a total and not just separately between the 10 established. For instance, in motives, we have a 10 motive as a yes response.
But I answer the question of the sample size with respect to the size of the population in the document I elaborated, and I explain why it does not matter the population size, that GEM needs to do 2,000 interviews at every region. Okay, you can just make some exceptions in Ceuta, Melilla, or provinces, but we justify why. Okay, if you collect less than 2,000, then you put limits to some indicators that because they cannot be shown because the sample is too small. Okay, so the sample size is not the problem. The problem is what do you do with data once collected? Because if the sample error is too big, you should not show these indicators. This is the problem. And I think that sometimes Spanish regions thinking, because I managed the Spanish before, okay, until 2012. Since I am not there, people has been doing in some regions what they wanted, reduce the sample because the cost is too much or they got not enough funds, etc. This is okay, but if they know what they can do and they cannot do with such samples, okay, if they continue presenting the complete report like they did in the past, then this is a problem because they are showing indicators that are not enough trustable. Okay, you cannot be confident on them, not at the same level as when they did the study using 2,000 individuals. Okay, so if they want to reduce, it's okay, but they need to reduce the report as well. And I explain in this document I prepared about this topic. I prepared some examples, what happens with reliability if samples are reduced, and how can teams calculate the sampling error posteriori to see if they can present or not some indicator. Okay.
Thank you, Alicia. I wanted to wrap up. We're at 2 minutes past the hour, and I want to be respectful of people's time. On that note, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you for the great questions and the interaction with us. We will be following up with a communication with the recording, with some additional answers to some of the questions that you have all asked, as well as we will also be following up in due course with future GEM learning sessions. So on that note, thank you everyone for joining, and wish you a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rodrigo.